Well, we're kind of finishing up on O scale this week by, well, touching on O scale in Europe and the rest of the world.
Ah, oh, heavens.
Oh, yeah, when you talk about O scale in the other countries, it's O scale because it's a big and complicated story is what it is. So just sort of by way of recapping, we have talked about the Society of Model Engineers who came up with the first numbered gauges clear back in the 1800s. The first American group to try to establish standardized scales and gauges was the NMRA, the National Model Railroad Association, which was founded in 1935, and the standards were adopted in the United States, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. And of course, they established O scale as 1/48th scale. But as we've also mentioned, in Europe, they modified O scale into 1/45th scale, and then later on in 143.5 scale, just for manufacturing, ease of manufacturing. So the Europeans formed MROP, the European Federation of National Model Railway Associations, to create their own standards.
I don't think your acronym matches.
Well, if you speak the right language, I think it's German, and then it's been translated, and probably the word order is different and everything.
Just like the Tannenbaum.
Oh, gosh. And so, as we've mentioned in previous shows, rather than adjust the gauge to match the 1/48th scale, they adjusted the scale to match the gauge.
I like that. I wonder if that'd work at the doctor's office.
Talk about putting your thumb on the scale. In this case, taking your thumb off the scale.
Your thumb, your toes, anything else that's removable?
Anyway, they called these new scales Q and then later on SMO to describe 1/45th scale, and then OF, capital O, small f, to say France, which is to say 143.5 scale, which was initially adopted in France. Parlez-vous français?
No, because
No.
I just switch a bunch of acronyms around when it's my scale.
So here's a beautiful locomotive in Q and or SMO, whichever one you want to pick. And here's a beautiful locomotive in 143.5 scale, which later on became known as scale 7 because it's 7 millimeters to the foot.
Oh, just watch where you put the colon.
Yeah, you don't want to misplace your colon.
No.
Now, interestingly, there's a group in Great Britain who call themselves the Scale 7 Group. And they model 33 millimeter gauge, which is 1.3 inches. It's sort of like a British version of Proto 48. So they're doing very accurate gauging, but instead of using 1/48th scale, they're using 143.5 scale because that's so much more common and popular in Great Britain. How's that for confusing?
I'm confused.
Anyway, they do some amazing modeling.
Oh, yeah, I'd be looking at that.
It's very much like Proto 48. It's just not 48. It's 43.5. Proto 43.5, I guess you could. They call it the Scale 7 group. Anyway, a pretty serious group of model railroaders.
Yes, I would dare say so.
And because this wasn't quite confusing enough, MROP created the NEMO10 standards.
Hi.
So if there's no letter after the standard, after the scale, then that means it's standard gauge, same as it would be under NMRA. But if there's a small m, that means it's meter gauge. If there's a small e, that means it's one of several different narrow gauges, E standing for Europe, because there are so many different narrow gauges in Europe. I means it's an industrial railroad of various gauges. And P means it's a park railroad of various gauges. Okay, 2-foot gauge. Now, 2-foot gauge is much more common in Europe than it is in the United States. And so, of course, they want to model that. And so they have O14, which is modeling O-scale 14 millimeter gauge. So it's a 2-foot gauge prototype modeled to 14 millimeter model gauge, which makes it accurate 2 foot when scaled to 143.5. 7 millimeters to the foot. But then by way of a cheat, they have O12, which is 12 millimeter gauge. And the reason they've done that is because they can use old TT mechanisms from the TT scale.
Right.
So here's some fun 2-foot gauge railroads. This is the 2-foot gauge Toddington narrow gauge railway. And this is the 2-foot gauge Efteling Stoomtrain in the Netherlands.
Neat.
Isn't that beautiful?
That's just really cute.
I want to go there and ride it.
Oh, absolutely.
Now here's an interesting scale, O16.5. Now this is the same as ON30, which is so popular everywhere. So it's HO track and O scale, but they're using 143.5 instead of 148. Other than that, it's the same as ON30.
Okay.
And while 30-inch gauge is virtually unknown in the United States, it's fairly common in the rest of the world. This is a 30-inch gauge railroad in Australia. And Australia, I swear they have every conceivable gauge in Australia for a prototype. And here we have a 16.5 scale 30-inch gauge model.
Right.
And so here's a designation that they use when modeling O scale, which is the 143.5 version of O scale on HO track, 16.5 millimeter, German 750 millimeter gauge. And that makes the gauge slightly too narrow on the model. Austrian 760 millimeter gauge, which is also too narrow, but then also Swiss 850 millimeter rack trains, which makes the gauge slightly too wide.
Oh my.
And so here's a beautiful model in OE of a Swiss rack train.
Oh, that's neat. I
And
like that.
And you can buy the track.
Oh.
Yeah, and they'll use it in both HO scale and OE, but you can buy rack rail track in HO gauge. And here's a pair of different scales. ON42, 42-inch gauge, which is a common prototype, also known as OJ for Japan, because they use a lot of 42-inch gauge in Japan. And in the continent of strange gauges, confused gauges, Australia. You know, they have places in Australia where they have 4 rails to support 3 different gauges all on the same track.
Yeah, it sounds like something I do.
And so here's a model of a 42-inch gauge Australian railroad. And here is a prototype Japanese 42-inch gauge on a turntable.
Well, that's really cool.
Isn't that neat?
That's neat.
And finally, meter gauge.
Oh.
One of the most common narrow gauge gauges in Europe, 1 meter gauge. And then the problem is, are you going to model that in 143.5 or 145? Because people model meter gauge in both of those scales.
Right.
Now, some modelers will simply use ON3 just as a cheat, because that's fairly close. One of the most popular scales for modeling meter gauge is the large scale G gauge or G scale.
Right.
Because all of those original LGB trains are actually all meter gauge models. But they're large scale, not O scale.
Right.
So here's a beautiful meter gauge railroad. And this is a tramway in Innsbruck, Austria.
Oh, wouldn't that be fun to see that?
Oh, that'd be so much fun. I'd love to get to Innsbruck.
Right.
Anyway, I hope this hasn't been too terribly confusing, because it is kind of confusing. Anyway, if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe to the channel. And you can do that with the upcoming blue button. Are we ready? Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet, and we hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Sunday. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.